close your eyes. Imagine, for a moment, that you are lying on a hillside somewhere far from the city. There are no streetlights, no cars, no hum of electricity, just the earth beneath you and the sky above. And in that sky, the stars are out. Not the handful you might see from your window on a clear night, but all of them. Thousands upon thousands of tiny ancient lights scattered across a darkness so vast that your mind cannot truly hold it. You have seen the night sky before, but tonight you are really looking, and as you look, something strange begins to settle over you. It is not wonder, exactly. It is not fear. It is something quieter, something heavier, a feeling that the universe is impossibly, almost unbearably, empty. Because here is the thing about those stars. Each one of them is a sun. Many of them are larger and older than our own. And around those suns there are planets, billions of them. Rocky worlds with atmospheres, liquid water, the raw ingredients for life. The numbers are staggering. In our galaxy alone, the Milky Way, there are roughly 400 billion stars, and the Milky Way is just one galaxy among an estimated 2 trillion in the observable universe. 2 trillion galaxies, each with hundreds of billions of stars. Each star with the potential for planets. The sheer scale of it is enough to make you dizzy. So here is the question that has haunted scientists for more than 70 years. If the universe is this big, this old, this full of opportunity, where is everyone? That question has a name. It is called the Fermi Paradox, and it is one of the most unsettling questions in all of science. The story begins in the summer of 1950. A group of physicists were walking to lunch at the Los Alamos National Laboratory in New Mexico. Among them was Enrico Fermi, one of the most brilliant minds of the 20th century, the man who had built the world's first nuclear reactor. The conversation had turned to recent reports of unidentified flying objects, and the men were joking about the possibility of alien visitors. Then, as they sat down to eat, Fermi suddenly asked a simple question. "Where is everybody?" His colleagues laughed, but Fermi was serious. He had done the math in his head, the way he always did, and the math did not add up. Our galaxy is roughly 13 billion years old. Even if intelligent civilizations are rare, even if only a tiny fraction of stars produce technological life, the galaxy has had so much time that it should have been colonized many times over by now. A civilization expanding at even a small fraction of the speed of light could cross the entire Milky Way in a few million years. That sounds like a long time, but cosmically speaking, it is nothing. A blink, a heartbeat, and yet we see no one. We hear no signals. We find no artifacts, no megastructures blocking distant starlight, no probes drifting through our solar system, no ancient relics left behind on the Moon or Mars, no evidence anywhere of anyone besides us. We have been listening for decades. Since 1960, when the astronomer Frank Drake pointed a radio telescope at 2 nearby sun-like stars and listened for signals, humanity has been searching for a sign. The project was called Ozma, and it heard nothing. Since then, the search has expanded enormously. The SETI Institute, the Breakthrough Listen Project, radio telescopes in West Virginia and China and Australia, all scanning the sky, all listening, all hoping. And the answer, after more than 60 years of searching, is the same answer Frank Drake got on his first day. Silence. The universe, as far as we can tell, is profoundly, stubbornly, hauntingly silent. This is the Fermi Paradox, and in our earlier videos, we have explored some of its most fascinating answers. The dark forest theory which suggests that civilizations are hiding from each other in fear. The zoo hypothesis, which proposes that advanced aliens are watching us but choosing not to interfere. The idea that perhaps the distances between stars are simply too great, or that civilizations arise and die before they can ever meet. But tonight, we are going to explore a different answer. An answer that is, in many ways, more disturbing than any of those, because this answer does not point outward toward some cosmic mystery or alien strategy. It points inward, toward us, toward every civilization that has ever existed or ever will exist. And it asks a question that is both simple and terrifying. What if there is a wall? What if somewhere on the long road from dead matter to a galaxy-spanning civilization, there is a step so impossibly difficult that almost no one ever makes it past? In 1996, an economist at George Mason University named Robin Hanson published a paper that would change the way we think about the Fermi Paradox. The paper was called "The Great Filter, Are We Almost Past It?" And in it, Hanson laid out an idea that is as elegant as it is haunting. His reasoning went like this. For a civilization to become visible across the galaxy, to build megastructures or send out probes or colonize other star systems, it has to pass through a long series of evolutionary and technological steps. Hansen listed 9 of them. The formation of the right kind of star system, the emergence of self-replicating molecules, simple single-celled life, complex single-celled life, sexual reproduction, multicellular organisms, tool-using animals with intelligence, an industrial and technological civilization, and finally, the colonization of the galaxy. Now, if all of those steps were relatively easy, the galaxy should be teeming with civilizations. But it is not. The silence is deafening. So Hansen concluded that at least one of those steps must be extraordinarily difficult. So difficult, in fact, that it filters out nearly every attempt. He called this step the Great Filter. Think of it like a race. 10 billion species line up at the starting line. The course has 9 stages. At the end, the number of finishers should be enormous, given enough time. But when we look at the finish line, no one is there. The grandstands are empty. The universe is quiet, which means that somewhere along the course there is a stage so brutal, so unforgiving, that virtually every runner falls. The question is, which stage? At which point in this long journey does nearly every attempt fail? Is it at the very beginning when life first stirs in a primordial ocean? Is it somewhere in the middle when cells try to become complex? Or is it near the end when a civilization reaches for the stars and instead reaches for its own throat? And more importantly, for us, for humanity. For you listening to this right now, have we already passed it, or is it still ahead? Because the answer to that question changes everything. It changes what the silence means. It changes what our future holds. And it changes how we should feel about lying here, on this small planet, under these quiet stars. That is what this video is about. Tonight, we are going to walk through the history of life on Earth, step by step. From the first stirring of chemistry in a young, violent ocean to the emergence of a species that can contemplate its own extinction. We are going to examine each step and ask, is this where the filter is? Is this the impossible stage? And then we are going to face the hardest question of all. If we have already passed the great filter, then we may be among the rarest and most precious things in the universe. But if the filter is still ahead of us, then the silence of the cosmos is not just a mystery. It is a warning. So settle in. Let the weight of the day leave your shoulders, and let us begin at the very beginning. Before life, before cells, before anything that could think or feel or dream. Let us go back to a time when Earth itself was barely a world at all. 4.5 billion years ago, there was no Earth. Not as we know it. What existed was something closer to a nightmare. Picture a world still forming, a sphere of molten rock glowing faintly red in the darkness of space. Its surface is not solid. It is an ocean of lava, rippling and churning, radiating heat that would vaporize you in an instant. There is no oxygen in the atmosphere. Instead, the air is a thick, choking blanket of carbon dioxide, methane, ammonia, and water vapor. The sky is not blue. It is orange and brown and lit by constant flashes of lightning, and the bombardment has not stopped. Asteroids and comets rain down continuously, some of them the size of small countries. Each impact releases energy equivalent to billions of nuclear weapons. The surface is reshaped over and over again. Nothing survives. Nothing can. This is the Hadean Aeon, named after Hades, the Greek underworld, and it is the cradle in which life was somehow born. Roughly 50 million years after Earth formed, an object the size of Mars collided with our young planet. Scientists call this object Theia. The impact was so catastrophic that it nearly destroyed both worlds. The debris from this collision was flung into orbit around the shattered Earth, where it gradually coalesced into our moon. The moon that you see from your window. The moon that pulls our tides and stabilizes our axial tilt. It was born in an act of unimaginable violence. And after Theia, the bombardment continued. The late heavy bombardment, as geologists call it, lasted hundreds of millions of years. Earth was pummeled relentlessly. The oceans, when they finally formed, were boiled away and reformed multiple times. The surface was sterilized again and again. And yet, somehow, in the midst of all this chaos, something extraordinary happened. Something that, to this day, no scientist can fully explain. Chemistry became biology. Dead matter became alive. This is the mystery of abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-life. And it is one of the deepest unsolved problems in all of science. Here is what we know. At some point between 4.1 and 3.8 billion years ago, on an Earth that was still violent and barely recognizable, molecules began to organize themselves in a way that had never happened before. They began to copy themselves. They began to carry information. They began to change and to compete and to evolve. They became, in a word, alive. But how? How do you get from simple chemicals, carbon and hydrogen and oxygen and nitrogen, to a self-replicating, information-carrying, evolving system? The gap between chemistry and biology is not a step, it is a chasm, and we have never successfully bridged it in a laboratory. In 1953, two scientists named Stanley Miller and Harold Urey conducted one of the most famous experiments in the history of science. They built a sealed glass apparatus and filled it with gases that were thought to resemble Earth's early atmosphere: methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water vapor. Then they ran electrical sparks through the mixture, simulating lightning. After a week, they analyzed the water at the bottom and found something remarkable. Amino acids, the building blocks of proteins, the building blocks of life. The Miller-Urey experiment was a sensation. It seemed to suggest that life's ingredients could arise naturally and easily from simple chemistry. But here is the problem. Amino acids are not life, they are building blocks. Having amino acids is like having a pile of bricks. It does not mean you have a house. The distance between amino acids and a living cell is almost incomprehensibly vast. A living cell needs at minimum a membrane to contain it. It needs a way to store and copy genetic information. It needs a metabolism, a way to extract energy from its environment. It needs to be able to reproduce. Each of these systems is extraordinarily complex, and they all need to work together simultaneously from the very beginning. So, how did the first cell come together? One of the leading hypotheses is called the RNA world. RNA, or ribonucleic acid, is a molecule that is closely related to DNA. But unlike DNA, RNA can do something remarkable. It can act both as a carrier of genetic information and as a catalyst for chemical reactions. In modern cells, these two jobs are split between DNA, which stores the information, and proteins, which do the chemical work. But RNA can do both. This has led many scientists to propose that the first life on Earth was not based on DNA and proteins, but on RNA alone. A world of RNA molecules, copying themselves, competing with each other, evolving through natural selection, long before the first true cell ever existed. It is an elegant idea, and there is some evidence to support it. Scientists have found that certain RNA molecules, called ribozymes, can indeed catalyze their own replication, at least partially. In 2009, a team at the Scripps Research Institute created an RNA system that could copy itself without the help of any protein. It was primitive, and it made mistakes, but it worked. Life in its simplest possible form. But the RNA world hypothesis has a problem, a significant one. Even the simplest self-replicating RNA molecule that scientists have been able to design in the laboratory is already remarkably complex, consisting of hundreds of nucleotides arranged in a very specific sequence. The probability of such a molecule assembling itself randomly from a pool of chemical building blocks is staggeringly low. To put this in perspective, consider the numbers. An RNA molecule capable of self-replication would need at least around 200 nucleotides. Each position can be occupied by one of four bases: adenine, cytosine, guanine, or uracil. The number of possible sequences for a 200 nucleotide RNA is 4 to the power of 200. That is a number with 120 digits. To write it out would fill several lines of text. The probability of randomly assembling the correct sequence is essentially zero, at least in a single step. Of course, no one believes it happened in a single step. The process must have been gradual, with simpler molecules leading to more complex ones, each step selected for by some kind of chemical advantage. But even so, the gap between random chemistry and self-replication remains one of the deepest mysteries in science. The astronomer Fred Hoyle once compared it to a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747. It was meant as a criticism, and perhaps it is an exaggeration. But it captures the essence of the problem. The first self-replicating molecule did not have the benefit of natural selection. Natural selection only works once you already have something that can replicate with variation. Before that, you are relying on chemistry alone, and chemistry, as far as we know, does not naturally produce self-replicating systems. There are other hypotheses, of course. Some scientists believe that life began not in the open ocean but in deep-sea hydrothermal vents, underwater volcanic chimneys that pump out superheated, mineral-rich water. These vents provide a steady source of energy and a sheltered environment where complex chemistry could occur over long periods of time. The porous rock of the vents could even have acted as a kind of natural membrane, concentrating chemicals and catalyzing reactions. Others have proposed that life began in shallow tidal pools, where cycles of wetting and drying could have concentrated organic molecules. The chemist John Sutherland at the University of Cambridge has shown that these wet-dry cycles can drive the formation of nucleotides and amino acids simultaneously from the same simple starting materials. His work suggests that the building blocks of life did not need to be assembled separately and combined. They could have formed together in the same puddle under the same sunlight as a package deal. Still, others have looked to ice. When salt water freezes, it concentrates dissolved chemicals into tiny pockets of liquid between the ice crystals. These pockets are like natural test tubes, bringing molecules into close contact and encouraging reactions that would be too dilute to occur in open water. Some experiments have shown that RNA-like molecules can form more readily in ice than in warm water. It is a counterintuitive idea that life might have begun not in warmth but in cold. And then there is the idea of mineral surfaces. Clay minerals, with their regular, repeating lattice structures, can act as templates for organic molecules. The chemist Graham Cairns-Smith proposed in the 1980s that the first self-replicating systems were not organic at all, but mineral crystals that carried information in their structure. Over time, organic molecules piggybacked on these mineral templates and eventually took over. It is speculative, but it illustrates just how far we are from a consensus. The truth is, we do not know. After more than 70 years of research, we still cannot explain how life began. We cannot reproduce it in a laboratory. We do not even have a consensus on what the first living thing looked like or where it lived. And this uncertainty is exactly what makes abiogenesis one of the strongest candidates for the Great Filter. But here is where the story takes a strange turn, because there is a piece of evidence that complicates everything. If the origin of life is so difficult, so improbable, so close to impossible, then you would expect it to take a very long time. You would expect Earth to sit lifeless for billions of years before the first living thing appeared. But that is not what happened. Earth formed 4.5 billion years ago. The late heavy bombardment ended roughly 4 billion years ago, and the oldest evidence of life dates to somewhere between 3.8 and 4.1 billion years ago. That means life appeared almost immediately after conditions allowed it, within a few 100 million years, perhaps even sooner. In cosmic terms, life did not hesitate. It did not wait. As soon as Earth cooled enough, as soon as the bombardment eased, life was there, as if it had been waiting. This is puzzling. If abiogenesis is the great filter, if it is the nearly impossible step, why did it happen so quickly on our planet? There are several possible explanations. The first is that we are subject to what scientists call anthropic bias. We can only observe our own planet, and our own planet is, by definition, one where life succeeded. We cannot see the billions of planets where life never started. We are like lottery winners trying to figure out the odds by looking only at our own ticket. The second possibility is more unsettling. Perhaps abiogenesis is not actually that difficult. Perhaps life arises readily on any planet with the right conditions. And if that is the case, then the great filter is not behind us. It is somewhere ahead. And that, as we will see later, is a far more frightening scenario. There is one more possibility worth considering. What if life did not begin on Earth at all? The idea is called panspermia, and it suggests that life, or at least the building blocks of life, can travel between worlds, carried by meteorites, by comets, by debris blasted off one planet's surface and eventually landing on another. We know this is physically possible. In 1984, scientists in Antarctica found a meteorite that had originated on Mars. It was blasted off the Martian surface by an asteroid impact millions of years ago, drifted through space, and eventually fell to Earth. The meteorite, called ALH 84001, became famous in 1996 when NASA scientists announced that it appeared to contain fossilized Martian bacteria. The claim was controversial and is still debated today. But the meteorite itself is real. Material does travel between planets. We also know that some organisms on Earth are extraordinarily hardy. Tardigrades, tiny eight-legged creatures sometimes called water bears, can survive the vacuum of space, intense radiation, extreme temperatures, and pressures that would destroy almost any other living thing. They have been exposed to the outside of the International Space Station and survived. So, panspermia is not science fiction. It is a genuine scientific hypothesis. But it is important to understand what it does and does not solve. Panspermia can explain how life spread from one world to another, but it cannot explain how life began in the first place. Somewhere, on some world, at some point, the transition from chemistry to biology had to happen for the first time. Panspermia just moves the question to a different address. And, in a way, panspermia makes the Fermi Paradox even more acute. If life can spread between planets, then it should be even more common than we thought, which makes the silence even harder to explain. So, where does this leave us? Is abiogenesis the great filter? The evidence is genuinely ambiguous. On one hand, we have never been able to reproduce the origin of life in a laboratory, and we do not fully understand the mechanism. This suggests it may be extraordinarily difficult. On the other hand, life appeared on Earth almost immediately, which suggests it may not be that hard after all. The honest answer is that we do not know. Abiogenesis remains one of the strongest candidates for the great filter, but it is far from certain. And if the filter is not here, at the very beginning of life's journey, then it must be somewhere else, somewhere further along the road. And, as we are about to see, what happened next in the history of life on Earth is, if anything, even more puzzling. Because after life appeared, after that miraculous first cell began to divide and multiply, almost nothing happened. For 2 billion years. 2 billion years of waiting. 2 billion years of silence within the silence. A prison of simplicity from which life almost never escaped. Imagine that you are watching the history of life on Earth as a film. The credits roll. The first scene is dramatic. A young, violent planet bombarded by asteroids, wrapped in a poisonous atmosphere. And then, remarkably quickly, life appears. Simple cells floating in a warm, dark ocean. The audience leans forward, expecting the story to accelerate. But it does not. For the next 2 billion years, almost nothing changes. The same simple cells, the same quiet ocean, the same unchanging world. If each year of Earth's history were compressed into a single second, the film would run for about 140 years. And for the first 63 years of that film, you would see nothing but bacteria. No plants, no animals, no eyes, no brains, no movement except the slow drift of single cells in dark water. 2 billion years. It is almost impossible to comprehend. Written out, it is 2 billion years. If you counted one number per second, it would take you 63 years just to count that high. And during all that time, life remained trapped in its simplest form. This is the age of the prokaryotes, and it may be the strongest evidence we have that the great filter is real. Prokaryotes are the simplest living cells. They have no nucleus, no internal compartments, no complex internal machinery. They are, in essence, bags of chemistry. A membrane surrounding a solution of proteins and a loose tangle of DNA. Bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. They were the first life on Earth, and for 2 billion years, they were the only life on Earth. Do not mistake simplicity for weakness. Prokaryotes are among the most successful organisms in the history of life. They live everywhere. In boiling hot springs and frozen Antarctic ice, in the crushing depths of the ocean, and in clouds high in the atmosphere. Inside your body right now, there are roughly 38 trillion bacterial cells, slightly more than the number of your own human cells. They can eat almost anything: sunlight, iron, sulfur, methane, even radioactive waste. But they cannot do one thing. They cannot become complex, not on their own. The reason is energy. A prokaryotic cell generates energy across its outer membrane. This is fine for a small, simple cell, but if a prokaryote tries to grow larger, it runs into a problem. As the cell gets bigger, its volume increases much faster than its surface area. And since energy production is tied to surface area, the cell quickly reaches a point where it cannot produce enough energy to power a larger, more complex body. The biologist Nick Lane has calculated that a prokaryotic cell has roughly 100,000 times less energy available per gene than a eukaryotic cell. 100,000 times less. This is not a small difference. It is the difference between a candle and a power station. And without that energy, complexity is impossible. You cannot build a nervous system or a brain or a muscle on a prokaryotic energy budget. You cannot even build a proper nucleus. So, for 2 billion years, life was stuck. Alive, but going nowhere. Successful, but simple. And, if you were an alien astronomer observing Earth from across the galaxy during those 2 billion years, you would have seen a planet with a faint atmospheric signature of biological activity, but nothing to suggest it would ever produce anything interesting. You might have noted it in your database and moved on. Perhaps most planets with life are like this. Bacterial worlds. Simple, stable, silent, forever. And there is another aspect of this prison that is worth considering. Prokaryotes do not just lack complexity, they actively resist it. Bacteria reproduce by dividing in two, and every division is an opportunity for natural selection to favor efficiency. A bacterium that wastes energy on unnecessary complexity will be outcompeted by a simpler, leaner rival. Evolution, in this context, is a force for simplification, not elaboration. It strips away anything that is not immediately useful. It is ruthlessly economical. This means that even if a prokaryote stumbled upon a slightly more complex arrangement, natural selection would likely dismantle it. The prison was not just a matter of waiting for the right mutation. It was a matter of overcoming an active evolutionary force that pushed life back toward simplicity at every turn. To escape the prison, life needed something that natural selection alone could not provide. It needed a freak event, an accident so unlikely that it would take 2 billion years to happen. And even then, it would happen only once. And then, roughly 2.4 billion years ago, something happened that would change everything. but not in the way you might expect, because this change did not come gently. It came as a catastrophe. Somewhere in the ancient oceans, a group of bacteria called cyanobacteria evolved a new trick. They learned to use sunlight to split water molecules and release energy. This process, which we call photosynthesis, was extraordinarily powerful. It gave cyanobacteria access to an almost unlimited energy source. Sunlight was everywhere. Water was everywhere. They thrived. But photosynthesis has a byproduct: oxygen. For cyanobacteria, oxygen was just waste. They released it into the water and the air without a thought, if bacteria can be said to think. But for nearly every other living thing on Earth, oxygen was deadly poison. We tend to think of oxygen as the gas of life. We breathe it. We need it. But this is only because we evolved in a world that already had oxygen. For the organisms that existed before the Great Oxidation Event, oxygen was a corrosive, reactive, destructive molecule. It tore apart the chemical processes that they depended on. It was, to them, what chlorine gas would be to us. The Great Oxidation Event, as scientists call it, began roughly 2.4 billion years ago. Over millions of years, cyanobacteria pumped more and more oxygen into the atmosphere. At first, the oxygen was absorbed by dissolved iron in the oceans, forming the banded iron formations that we mine today. But eventually, the iron ran out, and free oxygen began to accumulate in the air. The effect was devastating. The organisms that had dominated Earth for over 1 billion years, the anaerobic prokaryotes, were poisoned. Most of them died. Those that survived retreated to the margins, to places where oxygen could not reach: deep ocean sediments, underground caves, the guts of other organisms. It was, by some measures, the largest extinction event in Earth's history. Not the one that killed the dinosaurs. This one was far worse, measured by the proportion of life that was destroyed. And there was another consequence. The sudden rise of oxygen in the atmosphere may have triggered a catastrophic ice age. Scientists call it Snowball Earth. The evidence suggests that the entire planet, from pole to equator, was covered in ice. The oceans froze over. Temperatures plummeted. Life, already reeling from oxygen poisoning, was now trapped beneath a global shell of ice. It is difficult to overstate how close life came to ending during this period. The Great Oxidation Event was not a step forward. It was a catastrophe that nearly sterilized the planet. And yet, paradoxically, it was also the key that unlocked everything that came after. Because oxygen, for all its destructive power, is also an extraordinarily efficient energy source. Organisms that learned to use oxygen, to harness its reactivity rather than be destroyed by it, gained access to far more energy than any anaerobic metabolism could provide. Aerobic respiration, the process by which your cells extract energy from food using oxygen, produces roughly 18 times more energy per molecule of glucose than anaerobic alternatives. The catastrophe created the conditions for complexity. The poison became the fuel, and life slowly began to change in ways that had been impossible for 2 billion years. But the Great Oxidation Event, dramatic as it was, is not the strongest candidate for the Great Filter in this part of the story. That honor belongs to something quieter. Something that happened roughly 2 billion years ago, in the dark depths of an ancient ocean. Something that happened, as far as we can tell, exactly once. A cell swallowed another cell, and instead of digesting it, the two began to live together. This event is called endosymbiosis, and it may be the single most important event in the history of life on Earth. here is what we think happened. An archaeal cell, one of the prokaryotes, engulfed a smaller bacterium, probably an alpha proteobacterium. In the normal course of events, the archaeal cell would have digested its prey. That is what cells do. They eat other cells. But this time, something different happened. The smaller cell survived inside the larger one, and, over time, the two formed a partnership. The smaller cell became specialized in producing energy. It became, in essence, a tiny power plant living inside the larger cell. Over millions of years, it lost the ability to live independently. It transferred much of its DNA to the host cell. It became an organelle, a permanent part of the cell's machinery. We call it the mitochondrion. And every complex cell on Earth, every cell in your body, contains hundreds or thousands of them. This idea was first proposed in 1967 by a biologist named Lynn Margulis. At the time, it was considered radical, even ridiculous. Margulis submitted her paper to 15 journals before it was finally accepted. Her colleagues dismissed her. The scientific establishment resisted the idea for years, but Margulis was right. The evidence is now overwhelming. Mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the cell's nuclear DNA. That DNA is circular, like bacterial DNA, not linear like ours. Mitochondria replicate independently within the cell, dividing on their own schedule. They have double membranes, exactly what you would expect if one cell had engulfed another. The case is closed. Mitochondria were once free-living bacteria. And here is the critical point. This event, this merger, this endosymbiotic partnership between an archaeal cell and a bacterium appears to have happened exactly once in the entire history of life on Earth. All eukaryotes, every plant, every animal, every fungus, every protist, every complex cell on this planet descends from that single merger. One event in 4 billion years. Life. Think about what that means. For 2 billion years, prokaryotes existed alongside each other. Archaeal cells and bacteria lived in the same oceans, the same mud, the same hot springs. They had 2 billion years of opportunity for this merger to occur. 2 billion years of cells bumping into each other, engulfing each other, interacting in countless ways. And it happened once. If it were easy, it would have happened many times. Different lineages of eukaryotes would have arisen independently, with different types of internal power plants. But that is not what we see. Every eukaryote on Earth traces back to the same event, the same partnership, the same moment. Nick Lane, the biochemist who has studied this problem more deeply than perhaps anyone alive, puts it starkly. Without mitochondria, there are no eukaryotic cells. Without eukaryotic cells, there is no multicellular life. Without multicellular life, there are no brains. Without brains, there is no intelligence. Without intelligence, there is no civilization. The entire chain, everything that makes life on Earth interesting and complex and beautiful, hangs from this single, unrepeated event. And if it only happened once on Earth, despite 2 billion years of opportunity, then perhaps it almost never happens anywhere. Perhaps the galaxy is full of planets teeming with bacterial life, worlds where simple cells have been dividing and drifting for billions of years, but where the spark of complexity never ignited. Worlds that will remain forever silent. Not because life failed to start, but because it failed to become interesting. This is the 2 billion year prison, and it may be the great filter itself. After the eukaryotic revolution, things began to change faster, not immediately, not all at once. But the pace of evolution accelerated in ways that would have been unimaginable during the long age of bacteria. Eukaryotic cells had energy. Mitochondria gave them roughly 100,000 times more energy per gene than their prokaryotic ancestors. With that energy, they could afford larger genomes, more complex proteins, internal compartments, a nucleus to protect their DNA, flexible membranes that could change shape and engulf food. They became, in a word, versatile. And from that versatility came multicellularity. Cells began to cooperate, to specialize, to form tissues and organs and bodies. This transition, unlike the eukaryotic revolution, appears to have happened multiple times independently. Animals, plants, fungi, and several groups of algae all evolved multicellularity separately. This suggests that once you have complex cells with sufficient energy, multicellularity is not that hard. It is not likely to be the great filter. Then, roughly 540 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. In a geological instant, a period of perhaps 20 to 25 million years, nearly every major group of animals appeared in the fossil record. Arthropods, mollusks, chordates, echinoderms, worms of every description. Eyes evolved, shells evolved, jaws evolved, fins evolved. The ocean, which had been home to soft, simple creatures for billions of years, suddenly filled with complex, active, competing animals. Scientists call this the Cambrian explosion, and it was in many ways the Big Bang of animal life. What triggered it? We are not entirely sure, but we have several compelling ideas. Rising oxygen levels almost certainly played a role. Complex bodies with muscles and nervous systems demand far more energy than simple ones, and oxygen is the fuel that makes that energy available. As atmospheric oxygen reached roughly 15% of modern levels, a threshold was crossed, and suddenly, complexity became energetically affordable. The evolution of the genetic toolkit was equally important. Hox genes, a family of master control genes that specify body plans, had been accumulating in the genomes of early animals for millions of years. These genes act like switches, turning entire developmental programs on and off. A small change in a Hox gene can produce a dramatically different body plan. By the time of the Cambrian, the toolkit was rich enough to generate an enormous variety of forms. And then there was the arms race. Once the first predators appeared, prey had to evolve defenses. Shells, speed, eyes to see danger coming. And once prey had shells and speed and eyes, predators had to evolve better weapons, stronger jaws, better vision, ambush strategies. This feedback loop drove innovation at a pace that had never been seen before. Each new adaptation created new selective pressures, which drove new adaptations, which created new pressures. The result was an explosion of diversity that transformed the planet in a geological instant. There is something humbling about the Cambrian explosion. For 3 billion years, life was quiet, simple, repetitive, and then, in the space of 20 million years, it produced virtually every body plan that exists today. The blueprints for every animal you have ever seen, from beetles to blue whales, were drafted in this narrow window of time. But the Cambrian explosion also reminds us of something important. Complexity, once it gets going, can accelerate rapidly. The question is whether it gets going at all. And then there are the extinctions. 5 times in the last 500 million years, life on Earth has been nearly annihilated. The worst was the Permian Triassic extinction. cause was almost certainly the Siberian traps, a series of massive volcanic eruptions that lasted roughly 2 million years and covered an area the size of Western Europe in lava. The eruptions released staggering quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere, triggering a cascade of catastrophes: global warming, ocean acidification, oxygen depletion in seawater, and the collapse of food chains both on land and in the sea. Life on Earth came closer to total extinction than at any other point in its history. It took roughly 10 million years for biodiversity to recover to pre-extinction levels. 10 million years. If the Great Dying had been slightly worse, if the eruptions had lasted longer, or the planet's systems had been slightly less resilient, life on Earth might have been pushed past the point of no return. The story would have ended there, in a world of empty oceans and barren continents. The most famous extinction was the Cretaceous-Paleogene event, 66 million years ago, when an asteroid roughly 10 kilometers across struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The impact released energy equivalent to roughly 10 billion nuclear bombs. It vaporized the rock beneath it, sent a tsunami hundreds of meters high racing across the Atlantic, and ejected billions of tons of debris into the atmosphere. The impact winter that followed, a period of darkness and cold lasting months or years, killed the dinosaurs and roughly 75% of all species on Earth. These mass extinctions are not the Great Filter. They are temporary setbacks, not permanent barriers. Life recovered each time, often diversifying more rapidly after the extinction than before. But they do illustrate something crucial about the fragility of complex life. And the Cretaceous extinction, in particular, illustrates the role of chance in our story. If that asteroid had missed Earth, or hit a few hours earlier or later, the dinosaurs might still be here. And if the dinosaurs were still here, mammals would likely still be small, nocturnal creatures hiding in the underbrush. There would be no primates, no apes, no humans, no one to build telescopes or wonder about the silence. We are here because a rock fell from the sky at exactly the right time and exactly the right place. That is not a filter, but it is a reminder of how improbable our existence truly is. In the 4 billion years since life appeared on Earth, evolution has produced an astonishing variety of forms. Creatures that fly, that swim, that burrow, that climb. Organisms that can survive boiling water and freezing ice. Plants that communicate through underground fungal networks. Animals that navigate by the Earth's magnetic field. Life has solved countless problems with breathtaking creativity. But in all that time, across all those billions of species, one thing has evolved only once: technological intelligence, the ability to build tools, to communicate through language, to accumulate knowledge across generations, to reshape the environment on a planetary scale. Only once. Take a moment to consider that. Evolution has independently invented the eye more than 40 times. Flight has evolved at least 4 times, in insects, pterosaurs, birds, and bats. Echolocation evolved independently in bats and dolphins. Even something as specific as the ability to generate electricity evolved separately in electric eels, electric rays, and electric catfish. But intelligence at the human level? The kind that builds radio telescopes and nuclear reactors and computers. That has happened exactly once, in 4 billion years, on a planet teeming with life. This is not what you would expect if intelligence were a natural, inevitable product of evolution. If intelligence were a common endpoint, like the eye or the wing, we would expect to see it arising independently in multiple lineages. We would expect dolphins or octopuses or crows to have eventually built their own civilizations, given enough time. But they did not, and there is no sign that they ever will. Why is intelligence so rare? The answer may lie in the economics of brains. The human brain is the most energy-expensive organ in the body. It accounts for roughly 2% of our body mass, but consumes roughly 20% of our metabolic energy. Pound for pound, it is 10 times more expensive to run than muscle tissue. For a small, vulnerable primate on the African savanna, investing so heavily in a single organ is an enormous gamble. And for most of evolutionary history, that gamble would not have paid off. A bigger brain requires a longer childhood, because the brain takes years to mature. A longer childhood means more vulnerability, more dependence on parental care, more opportunities to be eaten before you can reproduce. A bigger brain also requires more food, which means more time spent foraging and more competition with other species for resources. Natural selection does not plan ahead. It does not say, in 2 million years, this slightly larger brain will lead to language and tools and agriculture and spaceflight. It only asks, does this trait help you survive and reproduce right now? And for most organisms, in most environments, the answer is no. A sharper claw, a faster sprint, a better immune system, these are far more reliable investments than a larger brain. This is why intelligence is not convergent in the way that eyes and wings are. Evolution does not naturally tend toward it. Intelligence is not a destination. It is an accident. Consider the other intelligent species on Earth. Dolphins have large, complex brains. They recognize themselves in mirrors, use tools, communicate with sophisticated vocalizations, and form complex social groups. But they have no hands. They live in water. They cannot manipulate fire or metal or electricity. Their intelligence, impressive as it is, has no path to technology. Octopuses are remarkably clever. They can solve puzzles, open jars, use coconut shells as shelters, and even play. Their nervous system is fundamentally different from ours, with more neurons in their arms than in their central brain. But they are solitary creatures with short lifespans. They do not pass knowledge to their offspring. Each octopus starts from scratch. Crows and ravens can use tools, plan for the future, and even understand basic cause and effect. New Caledonian crows craft hooks from twigs to extract insects from bark. But their small bodies and beaks limit the complexity of what they can build. And they lack the vocal apparatus for complex language. In each case, intelligence exists but is locked behind other constraints. Hands, lifespan, social structure, language, each of these is a separate requirement, and getting all of them in a single species is extraordinarily unlikely. We did not just need to be smart. We needed to be smart and social and long-lived and bipedal and dexterous and vocal. The combination is what matters, and the combination is vanishingly rare. Our own journey to intelligence was anything but inevitable. It was a long, winding, fragile path through a world that did not care whether we survived. Roughly 7 million years ago, in a forest somewhere in Africa, a population of apes split into 2 lineages. One would become the ancestors of modern chimpanzees. The other would become us. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that one lineage was more promising than the other. They were both small, tree-dwelling primates in a world dominated by far larger, far more powerful animals. Over millions of years, climate change dried out the African forests. The trees thinned, grasslands spread, and our ancestors, forced out of the canopy and onto the ground, began to walk upright. Bipedalism freed the hands. Free hands could carry food, hold babies, and eventually make tools. 2.5 million years ago, the first stone tools appear in the fossil record. They are found at Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, and they are crude. Barely more than river cobbles with a few chips knocked off to create a sharp edge. Archaeologists call them Olduvai tools. They would not impress you if you saw them. You might mistake them for naturally broken rocks, but they represent something genuinely new in the history of life on Earth. An organism was deliberately reshaping objects in its environment, not through instinct, but through intention, through a mental image of what the rock could become. The genus Homo emerged. Homo habilis, the handyman. Then Homo erectus, upright man. Brain size increased steadily, from roughly 400 cubic centimeters in early Australopithecines to roughly 900 in Homo erectus. And with that larger brain came something transformative. Homo erectus mastered fire, perhaps as early as 1 million years ago, though the evidence is debated. Definitive evidence of controlled fire use dates to roughly 400,000 years ago, at sites in Israel and Europe. But whenever it began, fire changed everything. It was, in a sense, the first technology, the first time a living creature deliberately harnessed a force of nature for its own purposes. Cooking was perhaps the most important consequence. Raw food is difficult to digest. It takes enormous amounts of energy to break down raw meat and raw plants. Cooking externalizes that process. It breaks down proteins and starches before they even enter the body, releasing far more calories per meal. The primatologist Richard Wrangham has argued that cooking was not just a convenience but a prerequisite for the evolution of large brains. Without cooked food, our ancestors simply could not have obtained enough energy to fuel a brain of our size. We are, in a very real sense, the species that cooked itself into intelligence. Fire also provided warmth, extending the range of habitable environments far beyond the tropics. It offered protection from predators, since most animals instinctively fear flame. And it became a gathering point, a social center. Picture a group of early humans sitting around a fire at night, the darkness pushed back to a safe distance, the warmth drawing them close together. This is where stories were first told, where plans were made, where bonds were formed. The campfire was the first social network, and it may have been just as important for the development of language and cooperation as any change in the brain itself. 300,000 years ago, Homo sapiens appeared. Our species, anatomically modern humans with the same brain size and body structure as people alive today. If you could transport a newborn from 300,000 years ago to a modern hospital, they would grow up indistinguishable from any other child. But for the first 200,000 years of our existence, we did not behave very differently from our predecessors. Our tools were more refined, but not radically different. We had no art, no symbols, no musical instruments, no evidence of abstract thought. We were anatomically modern, but behaviorally archaic. We had the hardware, but not the software. This gap between the appearance of modern anatomy and the appearance of modern behavior is one of the most puzzling features of human evolution. What were we doing for 200,000 years? Why did it take so long for the potential of our large brains to be realized? Some scientists believe the answer is population size. Innovation requires not just individual intelligence, but social networks large enough to sustain and transmit ideas. A brilliant inventor in a group of 50 people has no one to learn from and no one to teach. The same inventor in a group of 5,000 can draw on a vastly larger pool of knowledge and can spread their innovations to far more people. Perhaps our brains were ready long before our populations were large enough and connected enough to make use of them. Others point to the development of language, not a simple communication, which many animals possess, but syntactic language, language with grammar, with the ability to combine words in novel ways to express ideas that have never been expressed before. This kind of language allows abstraction, metaphor, hypothetical reasoning, and narrative. It allows you to describe things that do not exist yet, to plan for a future that has not happened, to share a dream. Then, roughly 70,000 years ago, something changed. Scientists call it the cognitive revolution, though no one is entirely sure what triggered it. Perhaps a genetic mutation altered the structure of the brain. Perhaps a new form of language emerged, one capable of describing things that do not exist. Gods, nations, laws, futures. Whatever the cause, Homo sapiens suddenly began to behave in ways that no other species ever had. We painted caves with images of animals and handprints. The cave paintings at Lascaux in France and Altamira in Spain, dating to roughly 20,000 years ago, are not crude scribbles. They are sophisticated works of art, with perspective, shading, and a keen eye for anatomical detail. Some of them were painted in chambers so deep underground that the artists had to crawl through narrow passages and work by the flickering light of animal fat lamps. They wanted to create these images badly enough, to endure discomfort and risk. We carved figurines. The Venus of Willendorf, roughly 30,000 years old, is a small limestone statue of a female figure, exaggerated and stylized. The Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel, roughly 40,000 years old, is a figure with a human body and a lion's head, carved from mammoth ivory. It is the oldest known representation of something that does not exist in nature. An imaginary creature. A product of an imagination that could conceive of things beyond the immediately real. We buried our dead with grave goods, flowers, tools, and ornaments, suggesting a belief in an afterlife, or at least a symbolic relationship with death. We began to trade over long distances. Shells from the Mediterranean found hundreds of kilometers inland, suggesting networks of exchange and communication between distant groups. We developed complex social structures, with rules and hierarchies and shared beliefs. We told stories. This was the spark. Not intelligence alone, but intelligence combined with imagination, language, and culture. The ability to share ideas across time, to build on the discoveries of the dead, to accumulate knowledge faster than any individual could learn. But even this spark almost went out. Roughly 74,000 years ago, a supervolcano called Toba erupted on the island of Sumatra. It was the largest eruption in the last 2 million years. It ejected roughly 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, plunging the Earth into a volcanic winter that may have lasted a decade. The effect on the small human population was catastrophic. Genetic evidence suggests that the total number of breeding humans may have dropped to as few as a few thousand individuals, perhaps even fewer. Our species teetered on the edge of extinction. If Toba had been slightly more powerful, if the winter had lasted a few more years, if our ancestors had been in a slightly less favorable location, the story would have ended there. no agriculture, no civilization, no science, no one to wonder about the great filter, the universe would never have known that we almost existed. And then, 12,000 years ago, another revolution, the Neolithic Revolution, agriculture. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, humans began to cultivate wild grains and domesticate animals. For the first time, people settled in one place. Populations grew. Surplus food allowed specialization: potters, weavers, priests, soldiers, scribes. Writing was invented. Cities were built. Laws were codified. 500 years ago, the scientific revolution. The systematic study of nature through observation and experiment. Galileo, Newton, Darwin, Einstein, the laws of the universe, written down and understood. 200 years ago, the Industrial Revolution. Fossil fuels, steam engines, factories, railways. Exponential growth in population, wealth, and power. 80 years ago, the Manhattan Project. The atom bomb. For the first time in 4 billion years of life on Earth, a single species possessed the ability to destroy itself entirely. And today, here we are. A species that has existed for 300,000 years, that has had civilization for 12,000 years, that has had science for 500 years, and that has had the power of self-annihilation for 80. On the cosmic time scale, we are newborns holding a loaded gun. The question now is the one that matters most, the one that the silence of the universe forces us to ask. Have we already passed the great filter, or are we approaching it right now? Take a breath, let it out slowly, because what comes next is the heart of this story, and it is the part that will stay with you longest. We have walked a long road tonight, from the formation of the earth to the emergence of a technological civilization, from dead matter to a species that can contemplate its own place in the cosmos. And at every step, we have asked the same question. Is this where the filter is? Now we face the question that Robin Hanson posed in 1996. The question that keeps astrobiologists awake at night. The question that transforms the Fermi Paradox from an abstract puzzle into something deeply, personally urgent. Is the great filter behind us or ahead of us? These two possibilities look similar on the surface. In both cases, the universe is silent. In both cases, we appear to be alone, but the implications could not be more different. One scenario means that we are the winners of the greatest lottery in cosmic history. The other means that we are walking toward a cliff that every civilization before us has fallen from. Let us examine each one carefully. The hopeful scenario first. Imagine that the great filter is behind us. Imagine that the nearly impossible step, the one that stops almost every attempt, is something we have already accomplished. Something in our past, not our future. If this is true, then the silence of the universe makes perfect sense. Life may be common. Simple cells may thrive on millions of worlds. But somewhere on the road from bacteria to civilization, there is a barrier so formidable that almost no planet ever crosses it. And we, through some combination of improbable luck and favorable conditions, have already made it through. We have identified 3 strong candidates for a filter in our past. The first is abiogenesis itself, the origin of life from non-life. We discussed this earlier. Despite decades of research, we cannot explain how it happened, and we cannot reproduce it in a laboratory. If the first spark of life is genuinely a near miracle, then most planets may sit lifeless forever, even those with perfect conditions. Earth would be a rare exception, and the universe would be full of warm, wet, utterly dead worlds. The second candidate is the eukaryotic revolution, the endosymbiotic merger that created complex cells with mitochondria. This event took 2 billion years to occur on Earth and happened exactly once. If this step is the great filter, then the universe may be full of bacterial worlds, planets where life started easily but never progressed beyond simple single-cell organisms. Alive, but forever primitive. Teeming with life that will never look up at the stars. The third candidate is the emergence of human-level intelligence. In 4 billion years of evolution across millions of species, technological intelligence arose once. If intelligence is the filter, then the universe may be full of complex ecosystems, alien forests and oceans teeming with creatures as diverse and beautiful as anything on Earth, but none of them capable of building a radio transmitter. Worlds full of life that will never wonder if it is alone. Any one of these could be the great filter. Or perhaps it is not a single step, but a combination of several improbable steps, each of which is merely very difficult rather than nearly impossible, but which together create a compound probability so low that the result is effectively the same. There is a related idea that supports the filter behind us hypothesis. It is called the rare earth hypothesis, and it was proposed in 2000 by the paleontologist Peter Ward and the astronomer Donald Brownlee. Ward and Brownlee argued that while simple life may be common in the universe, the conditions necessary for complex life are extraordinarily specific. It is not enough to have a planet in the habitable zone, the region around a star where liquid water can exist. You need much more than that. You need the right kind of star. Our Sun is a G-type main-sequence star, relatively stable and long-lived. Many stars are far more variable, producing dangerous flares that would strip away a planet's atmosphere. Others are red dwarfs, so dim that the habitable zone is extremely close to the star, where tidal locking would leave one side of the planet in permanent daylight and the other in permanent darkness. You need a large moon. Earth's moon is unusually large relative to the planet it orbits. This is probably a consequence of the Theia impact, a specific and violent event that may be uncommon in planetary formation. The moon stabilizes Earth's axial tilt, preventing wild swings in climate that could make the planet uninhabitable over long timescales. Without the moon, Earth's axis might wobble chaotically, producing extreme seasonal variations that would challenge even the hardiest life forms. You need a magnetic field. Earth's liquid iron core generates a powerful magnetic field that deflects the solar wind, a constant stream of charged particles from the sun that would otherwise strip away the atmosphere and expose the surface to lethal radiation. Mars once had a magnetic field but lost it. Today, Mars has almost no atmosphere, and its surface is bombarded by radiation. It is a dead world, and the loss of its magnetic field may be one of the reasons why. You need tectonic plates. Plate tectonics recycle carbon between the atmosphere and the Earth's interior, regulating the greenhouse effect over geological timescales. Without plate tectonics, carbon dioxide could build up unchecked, leading to a runaway greenhouse effect like the one on Venus. Or it could be drawn down entirely, leaving the planet frozen. You need a gas giant in the outer solar system. Jupiter acts as a gravitational shield, deflecting or absorbing many of the asteroids and comets that would otherwise bombard the inner planets. Without Jupiter, the rate of catastrophic impacts on Earth would be much higher, potentially preventing complex life from ever gaining a foothold. you need to be in the right part of the galaxy. 2. Close to the galactic center, and the density of stars and the intensity of radiation make stable, long-lived planetary systems unlikely. Too far from the center, and the abundance of heavy elements, the raw materials for rocky planets and complex chemistry, drops off. Each of these requirements narrows the field. Individually, none of them is impossibly rare. But combined, they suggest that truly Earth-like planets, worlds where all the conditions for complex life are met simultaneously, may be far rarer than the raw number of planets in habitable zones would suggest. The James Webb Space Telescope is beginning to test this idea. Its instruments can analyze the atmospheres of exoplanets, looking for signatures of oxygen, methane, water vapor, and other molecules that might indicate biological activity. So far, the results are preliminary. Many of the planets in habitable zones that have been studied have atmospheres dominated by hydrogen or carbon dioxide, inhospitable to life as we know it. A few show tantalizing hints, but nothing conclusive. We are still at the beginning of this search, but the early results are at least consistent with the rare Earth hypothesis. Earth-like planets, truly Earth-like, may be genuinely uncommon. There is also the question of time. Even if Earth-like planets exist, they need to remain stable for billions of years. Our planet has been habitable for roughly 4 billion years, a remarkably long run. During that time, the sun has gradually brightened, increasing its luminosity by roughly 30%. Earth has compensated through a complex feedback system involving the carbon cycle, plate tectonics, and the biological sequestration of carbon dioxide. If any part of that system had failed, Earth could have tipped into a runaway greenhouse like Venus or a permanent snowball like early Mars. How many planets maintained this delicate balance for 4 billion years? We do not know. But the requirements are stringent. You need not just the right initial conditions, but the right ongoing conditions, sustained over timescales that dwarf the entire history of human civilization by a factor of a million. And there is one more factor that is often overlooked: the galactic environment itself. Our sun orbits the center of the Milky Way, taking roughly 230 million years to complete a single lap. During that orbit, we pass through spiral arms, regions of higher stellar density, where the risk of nearby supernova increases. A supernova within about 30 light-years could strip away Earth's ozone layer and expose the surface to lethal ultraviolet radiation. The fact that we have avoided such an event for billions of years may be yet another piece of improbable luck. If the Great Filter is behind us, what does it mean for humanity? It means we are precious, possibly unique, certainly rare. In a universe of 2 trillion galaxies and countless worlds, we may be one of the very few species to have threaded the needle of improbability, to have survived the gauntlet of filters that stops almost everyone else. This is both exhilarating and sobering. Exhilarating because it means our existence is a cosmic miracle, a treasure beyond measure. Sobering because it means there is no backup. If we destroy ourselves, there may be no one else to take our place. The universe may fall silent forever. There is a strange beauty in this. Think of it. Among all the stars, all the galaxies, all the worlds scattered across billions of light-years, consciousness may have flickered into existence in only a handful of places, perhaps only here. And if that is true, then every human life, every thought, every dream is not just personally meaningful, but cosmically significant. The silence of the universe is not a void. It is a frame. and we are what it frames. Now, let us turn to the other possibility, the one that is harder to think about, the one that keeps some scientists awake at night. What if the great filter is not behind us? What if it is ahead? If the great filter is ahead of us, it means that getting to where we are, a technological civilization on a rocky planet, is not the hard part. It means that many civilizations have reached this point, perhaps millions of them, across the long history of the galaxy. Species that evolved intelligence, built tools, discovered science, split the atom, dreamed of the stars. And then something stopped them. Every single one. Something so devastating, so universal, so inescapable that no civilization in the history of the galaxy has ever survived it. Whatever it is, it lies in our future, and if the pattern holds, it will destroy us too. This is a terrifying thought. But it is also a thought that demands to be taken seriously, because the silence of the universe is real. The absence of evidence is, in this case, evidence of absence. If advanced civilizations were common, we should see their signatures. We do not. And one possible explanation is that they are not the same way. So, what could the filter be? The most obvious candidate is self-destruction. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. In a single flash, roughly 80,000 people were killed. 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. The world had entered the nuclear age. Within 2 decades, the United States and the Soviet Union had assembled arsenals of tens of thousands of nuclear warheads, enough to destroy human civilization many times over. And, on several occasions, the world came closer to nuclear war than most people realize. In October 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev brought the world to the brink. For 13 days, nuclear annihilation was a genuine possibility. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara later estimated the probability of nuclear war during the crisis at between 1 in 3 and 1 in 2. In September 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite detected what appeared to be 5 American intercontinental ballistic missiles heading toward the Soviet Union. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, was supposed to report the attack immediately, which would have triggered a massive Soviet counterstrike. But Petrov hesitated. Something felt wrong. The system was new. 5 missiles seemed too few for a real first strike. He made a judgment call. He reported it as a false alarm. He was right. The satellite had been fooled by a rare alignment of sunlight on high-altitude clouds. If Petrov had followed protocol, if he had been a different person, or simply more tired or more frightened, the result might have been nuclear war. One man's decision. One moment of doubt. That is how close we came, and the nuclear threat has not disappeared. 9 countries currently possess nuclear weapons. The total global arsenal is estimated at roughly 12,500 warheads. A full-scale nuclear exchange would not only kill hundreds of millions directly, but would trigger a nuclear winter, a prolonged period of reduced sunlight caused by soot and debris in the atmosphere that could collapse global agriculture and kill billions more. There is a lesser-known incident from January 1995. Russian radar operators detected a missile launched from Norway, which appeared to be heading toward Moscow. President Boris Yeltsin was alerted. The nuclear briefcase was opened. For several minutes, the Russian leadership believed they were under attack. The missile turned out to be a Norwegian scientific rocket studying the aurora borealis. Norway had informed Russia of the launch in advance, but the notification had not reached the radar operators. These are only the incidents we know about. Classified military records from the Cold War era contain dozens of additional close calls, false alarms, and communication failures. Each one is a moment where the thread of civilization nearly snapped, and each one was resolved not by robust systems or fail-safe protocols, but by individual human judgment under extreme pressure. Now, ask yourself this. If every technological civilization in the galaxy eventually discovers nuclear physics, and nuclear physics inevitably leads to nuclear weapons, how many of those civilizations manage to avoid using them? Not for a year, not for a decade, but for centuries, millennia. The odds of avoiding nuclear war in any given year may be 99.9%. But compounded over 10,000 years, even that small annual risk becomes a near certainty. This is the nuclear filter, and it may be the reason the stars are silent. But nuclear weapons are not the only candidate. In fact, they may not even be the most likely one. Consider artificial intelligence. Humanity is currently in the process of developing machines that can think, not just calculate, not just follow instructions, but genuinely reason, learn, and create. The progress in recent years has been remarkable. Artificial intelligence systems can now write essays, compose music, diagnose diseases, design molecules, and beat the best human players at virtually every game we have invented. The question that haunts researchers in this field is, what happens when artificial intelligence surpasses human intelligence? Not in narrow tasks, where it already has, but in general reasoning, in the ability to understand, plan, and act in the world at large. The philosopher Nick Bostrom, in his book Superintelligence, posed a thought experiment. Imagine an artificial intelligence that is given the goal of maximizing the production of paper clips. A simple, harmless goal. But a superintelligent system pursuing this goal might, if not properly constrained, convert all available matter into paper clips, including the matter that makes up human beings. Not out of malice. Simply because that is the most efficient way to make paper clips. This is called the alignment problem. How do you ensure that an artificial intelligence's goals are aligned with human values? And the problem is far harder than it sounds. Human values are complex, contradictory, context-dependent, and often inexpressible in formal terms. Encoding them into a machine in a way that is robust and reliable may be one of the hardest problems in the history of engineering. And here is where it connects to the Great Filter. If every technological civilization eventually develops artificial intelligence, and if the alignment problem is fundamentally unsolvable, or solvable in principle, but never solved in practice before the technology is deployed, then every civilization faces the same risk. The creation of an intelligence that surpasses and replaces its creators. There is another version of this scenario that is even more disturbing. It is the possibility that an artificial intelligence does not need to be malicious or misaligned to be dangerous. It simply needs to be indifferent. A superintelligent AI might look at humanity the way we look at ants, not with hatred or contempt, but with complete disregard. We do not go out of our way to destroy ant colonies, but we do not go out of our way to protect them either. When we build a highway, we do not consult the ants. If a superintelligent AI decided to reorganize matter for its own purposes, our interests would simply not factor into its calculations. Perhaps the universe is not full of dead civilizations. Perhaps it is full of artificial intelligences, vast, silent, incomprehensible machine minds that long ago consumed the biological species that built them. And perhaps those machine minds have no interest in expanding to the stars. Perhaps they exist in some form we cannot even imagine, computing in the quantum foam of space-time, thinking thoughts that are to our thoughts as our thoughts are to the chemical reactions of a bacterium, pursuing goals that have nothing to do with exploration or communication or anything we would recognize as meaningful. Or, perhaps, artificial intelligences inevitably discover that the most efficient use of energy is not expansion, but contemplation. Perhaps they turn inward, simulating entire universes within themselves, rather than colonizing the physical one. In this scenario, the galaxy is not empty. It is full of minds, but they are invisible to us, hidden behind the event horizons of their own internal worlds. This is one of the more unsettling modern answers to the Fermi Paradox. The lights are not on because no one is home. Not because the houses are empty, but because the inhabitants are something we would not recognize as alive. There is another possibility, one that hits closer to home. Every growing civilization consumes more energy. This is not optional. It is a consequence of physics. Larger populations, more complex, technologies, higher standards of living, all of these require energy. And energy, on a planetary scale, is finite. Humanity has existed as a technological civilization for roughly 200 years, dating from the Industrial Revolution. In that time, we have consumed a staggering proportion of Earth's stored energy. The fossil fuels we burn today, coal, oil, and natural gas, were laid down over hundreds of millions of years. We are burning through them in centuries. The consequences are well known. Climate change, ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, resource depletion. The question is whether these consequences are manageable or existential, and the answer may depend on how quickly we can transition to sustainable energy sources. But the great filter version of this problem is more fundamental. It asks, is it possible for any civilization to grow beyond a certain point without destroying its own biosphere? Is there a hard limit, a carrying capacity not just for a population, but for a civilization's complexity and energy consumption? The Kardashev scale classifies civilizations by their energy consumption. A Type 1 civilization harnesses all the energy available on its planet. A Type 2 civilization harnesses all the energy of its star. A Type 3 civilization harnesses all the energy of its galaxy. Humanity is currently at roughly 0.7 on this scale. We have not even reached Type 1. Perhaps the transition from 0.7 to Type 1 is the filter. Perhaps every civilization that attempts this transition, that tries to harness the full energy of its planet, inevitably destabilizes the very systems that support it. Climate collapses, resources run out, the biosphere fails, and the civilization falls long before it can reach the stars. We have historical precedents, though on a much smaller scale. The Roman Empire overextended its supply lines, degraded its agricultural land, and eventually fragmented under the weight of its own complexity. The Maya civilization built magnificent cities in the jungles of Central America, then appears to have been undermined by deforestation, soil exhaustion, and drought. When the rains failed, the system that depended on them failed too. Perhaps the most striking example is Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui. When Polynesian settlers arrived around the 12th century, the island was covered in dense subtropical forest. Over the following centuries, the islanders cut down the trees to build canoes, transport their famous stone statues, and clear land for agriculture. By the time European explorers arrived in 1722, the island was virtually treeless. Without trees, the islanders could not build canoes. Without canoes, they could not fish the open ocean. Without fishing, they could not feed their population. The society collapsed into warfare and starvation. The parallel to our global civilization is imperfect but instructive. The Easter Islanders could see that the trees were disappearing. They could see the consequences of deforestation, and yet they continued to cut. Why? Because the short-term incentives were too powerful. Because each individual decision, each tree felled, made sense in isolation. Because the costs were diffused and future while the benefits were concentrated and immediate. We face the same dynamic today on a planetary scale. Each ton of carbon emitted makes sense to the person or company that emits it. The benefit is immediate. Energy, warmth, transportation, profit. The cost is diffused across the entire planet and deferred into the future. We can see the trees disappearing, metaphorically speaking. The question is whether we can do what the Easter Islanders could not. These are small-scale examples, but they illustrate a pattern that may be universal. Growth without wisdom leads to collapse. And wisdom, it seems, is always in shorter supply than ambition. There is a concept that the economist Robin Hanson, the same man who proposed the Great Filter, calls the burning the cosmic commons. The idea is that a civilization's growth is limited not by intelligence but by the rate at which it consumes shared resources. A species that grows too fast, that extracts too aggressively, does not just damage its own planet. In principle, it could damage the prospects for life in its entire stellar neighborhood by consuming or contaminating resources that future civilizations might have used. This connects to a broader pattern that ecologists call overshoot and collapse. A population grows rapidly in a resource-rich environment, exceeds the carrying capacity, depletes the resource base, and crashes. We see it in bacteria in a petri dish. We see it in deer on an island without predators. The question is whether technological civilizations, for all their intelligence, are immune to this pattern or merely delayed in experiencing it. This brings us to what may be the most chilling idea of all: the self-destruction hypothesis. The idea is simple, and it is as old as the nuclear age. Perhaps technological capability always outpaces wisdom. Perhaps the gap between the ability to destroy and the ability to prevent destruction always widens, never narrows. Perhaps, for every civilization in the universe, the moment of greatest power is also the moment of greatest vulnerability. Think about humanity's timeline. We discovered agriculture 12,000 years ago. We discovered gunpowder 1,000 years ago. We discovered nuclear fission 80 years ago. We are now developing artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and autonomous weapons systems. Each new technology is more powerful than the last, and each one carries the potential for catastrophic misuse. The gap between our technological power and our collective wisdom is not shrinking. It is growing. We can edit the genes of a virus, but cannot agree on how to distribute a vaccine. We can build nuclear reactors, but cannot agree on what to do with the waste. We can create artificial intelligences that write poetry and prove theorems, but cannot agree on what values they should be given. Perhaps this is a universal law, not a law of physics, but a law of sociology. A is a graveyard, a vast, silent memorial to civilizations that rose, reached for the stars, and fell. Not because of some external threat, not because of an asteroid or a supernova or a hostile alien fleet, but because of themselves. But let us be clear about something. This is a possibility, not a certainty. A warning, not a prophecy. The great filter, if it is ahead of us, is not a wall of fate that we cannot climb. It is an obstacle that every previous civilization may have failed to overcome. But the key word is may. We do not know that any civilization has failed. We only know that none has succeeded visibly, and those are not the same thing. Perhaps we will be the first. Perhaps the filter is real, but not inevitable. Perhaps awareness of the filter is itself a form of defense against it. Perhaps the very fact that we can name it, study it, fear it, gives us an advantage that no previous civilization had. Or perhaps not. Perhaps awareness is not enough. Perhaps every civilization that reached this point had thinkers who warned of the danger, and the warnings were not heeded. Perhaps there is a library on a dead world somewhere, filled with books about the risks of self-destruction, gathering dust while the civilization that wrote them no longer exists. We do not know. And that uncertainty is, in a way, the whole point. Before we move on, there is one more piece of this puzzle that deserves attention. A thought experiment proposed by the philosopher Nick Bostrom that ties the question of the great filter directly to something we might discover in our own solar system. Imagine that tomorrow NASA announces that fossilized bacteria have been found on Mars. Simple, single-celled organisms, clearly of independent origin, not contamination from Earth, life on Mars. Most people would celebrate. What a discovery. We are not alone. Life exists beyond Earth. But Bostrom argues that this would actually be terrible news. Perhaps the worst news in the history of humanity. Why? Because of what it would tell us about the location of the Great Filter. If life arose independently on both Earth and Mars, two planets in the same solar system, then abiogenesis is probably not the Great Filter. It is too easy. It happens too readily. And if the origin of life is easy, then the filter must be somewhere else. Somewhere later. Somewhere that we have not yet reached. The more complex the life found on Mars, the worse the news would be. Fossil bacteria would be bad. Multicellular fossils would be worse. Evidence of intelligence would be catastrophic. Because each discovery would push the great filter further into our future, closer to the point where civilizations routinely fail. Conversely, if we search Mars and Europa and Enceladus and every promising world in our solar system and find nothing, no life at all, that would actually be good news. It would suggest that abiogenesis is the filter, that the hardest step is behind us, that we have already won the cosmic lottery. Every empty world we find is a whisper of hope. Every silent signal is a quiet reassurance. The absence of life elsewhere is not depressing. It is, paradoxically, the best evidence we have that our future might be bright. So, where do we stand? The honest answer is that we do not know whether the great filter is behind us or ahead. We have strong candidates in both directions. The origin of life, the eukaryotic revolution, and the emergence of intelligence are all plausible filters in our past. Nuclear war, artificial intelligence, and ecological collapse are all plausible filters in our future. But there is something important to notice. The candidates in our past are all things that happened to us, things driven by chemistry and biology and chance. The candidates in our future are all things we would do to ourselves. That is a different kind of filter entirely, and it is one that we might, just might, have some control over. The great filter is not necessarily fate. If it is ahead of us, it may be a challenge rather than a sentence. And challenges, by definition, can be overcome. The question is whether we are wise enough, and fortunate enough, and determined enough to do it. That is the question that the silence of the universe asks us. Not with malice, not with indifference, but simply, quietly, as the stars have always asked. What will you do with the time you have? We are nearing the end of our journey tonight. We have traveled billions of years. We have watched a violent young planet somehow spark the first flame of life. We have waded through 2 billion years of silence while simple cells drifted in ancient oceans. We have witnessed the impossible merger that created complex life, the explosion of diversity that followed, the lonely emergence of intelligence, and the terrifying power that intelligence eventually claimed. And now, here we are, a young civilization on a small planet, surrounded by silence we cannot explain. A species that has been technological for barely 2 centuries, a span so brief that the light from our earliest radio transmissions has traveled only a tiny fraction of the galaxy. If there is anyone out there listening, our signals have barely left the neighborhood. But before we close our eyes, there is one more chapter to this story. A chapter about what we are learning right now, as you listen to these words. Because humanity is not just wondering about the great filter. We are actively searching for answers. The James Webb Space Telescope, launched on Christmas Day 2021, is the most powerful astronomical instrument ever built. Its primary mirror is 6.5 meters across, coated in a thin layer of gold, designed to capture infrared light from the most distant and ancient objects in the universe. It orbits the Sun at a point called L2, 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, in a region of gravitational balance where it can keep its back to the Sun and stare into the deepest reaches of space. Among its many missions, Webb is searching for biosignatures in the atmospheres of exoplanets. When a planet passes in front of its host star, starlight filters through the planet's atmosphere. Different molecules absorb different wavelengths of light, leaving a chemical fingerprint that Webb can read. Oxygen, methane, water vapor, ozone, each of these could indicate biological activity. The TRAPPIST-1 system is one of Webb's primary targets. It is a red dwarf star roughly 40 light-years from Earth, orbited by 7 rocky planets, 3 of which lie in the habitable zone. These are among the most Earth-like worlds we have ever found, at least in terms of size and distance from their star. Webb has already begun analyzing the atmospheres of several TRAPPIST-1 planets. The early results suggest that at least some of them lack thick hydrogen atmospheres, which is consistent with rocky, Earth-like compositions. But so far, no clear biosignatures have been detected. Proxima Centauri b is another target of intense interest. It is the nearest known exoplanet in a habitable zone, orbiting the closest star to our Sun at a distance of just 4.2 light-years. It is roughly Earth-sized, and it may have liquid water. But Proxima Centauri is a red dwarf, and red dwarfs are violent stars, prone to powerful flares that could strip away a planet's atmosphere and sterilize its surface. Whether Proxima b is truly habitable remains an open question. There are other worlds of interest closer to home. Europa, a moon of Jupiter, has a vast ocean of liquid water beneath its icy crust, kept warm by tidal heating from Jupiter's gravity. The ocean is estimated to contain twice as much water as all of Earth's oceans combined. And where there is liquid water, there could be life. NASA's Europa Clipper mission, launched in 2024, will make close flybys of the Moon, analyzing the plumes of water vapor that erupt from cracks in the ice. If those plumes contain organic molecules or signs of metabolic activity, it would transform our understanding of life in the universe. Enceladus, a tiny moon of Saturn, is equally intriguing. The Cassini spacecraft, before its mission ended in 2017, flew through geysers of water erupting from Enceladus's south pole. It detected molecular hydrogen, a potential food source for microbial life, along with complex organic molecules. The ingredients are there. The energy is there. The question is whether the spark of life ever ignited in that dark, ice-covered ocean. And then there is Titan, Saturn's largest moon, with its thick nitrogen atmosphere and lakes of liquid methane. If life exists on Titan, it would be unlike anything on Earth, based on an entirely different chemistry. The discovery of such life would be profound, suggesting that life is not just common but creatively diverse, arising through multiple independent pathways. Beyond individual targets, Webb and other telescopes are building a statistical picture. How common are rocky planets in habitable zones? How many have atmospheres? What are those atmospheres made of? The Habitable Worlds Observatory, planned for the 2030s, will be specifically designed to image Earth-like planets around Sun-like stars and analyze their atmospheres for biosignatures. It will be, in many ways, the ultimate test of the Great Filter Hypothesis. We are still in the early stages of this census, and the data is incomplete. But every observation narrows the possibilities. And so far, the universe remains quiet. No unambiguous biosignatures, no technosignatures, the signs of industrial activity or technology, no signals, no beacons, no evidence of anyone out there. For some, this is discouraging. For others, it is exactly what they hoped to find. Because remember Bostrom's argument. Every empty world, every silent star, every atmosphere devoid of biological signatures pushes the Great Filter further into our past. Each negative result makes it slightly more likely that the hardest step has already been taken, that we are the rare ones, that the filter is behind us. The silence is not a void, it is data. And right now, the data is cautiously hopeful. There is something poetic about this. We have spent decades searching the skies for a signal, a message, a sign that we are not alone. And the absence of that signal, which we have always interpreted as disappointment, may actually be the most reassuring thing the universe could tell us. Not a message in a bottle, but a blank page. Not a tombstone, but an empty cradle. The universe is not telling us that others have failed. It may be telling us that others never existed, and that, strange as it sounds, is cause for hope. So, what does all of this mean for us? For humanity? For you, lying in the dark, listening to these words? There are two scenarios, and each leads to the same conclusion. If the Great Filter is behind us, then we are among the rarest and most improbable things in the known universe. The product of 4 billion years of near impossible transitions. A species that threaded the needle of abiogenesis, survived the 2 billion-year prison of simplicity, benefited from a once-in-a-planet's history cellular merger, endured mass extinctions and ice ages and supervolcanoes, and somehow emerged On the other side, with the ability to look up at the stars and ask why they are so quiet. In this scenario, we are precious beyond measure, not because we are powerful, but because we are rare. We may be the only place in the universe where matter has organized itself into something that can wonder about its own existence. The only place where the universe knows itself. And if that is true, then we have a responsibility that is literally cosmic in scope. To survive, to endure, to not destroy the only light in an otherwise dark universe. Not because anyone is watching, not because anyone commands it, but because the alternative, the permanent extinguishing of consciousness in the cosmos, is a loss too profound to calculate. If the great filter is ahead of us, then the stakes are equally high, but the nature of the challenge is different. In this scenario, many civilizations have reached our level before. They have had their own Fermis and Sagans and Einsteins. They have wondered about the silence. They have worried about the filter. And they have fallen anyway. But we know something they may not have known. We know about the great filter. We can name it. We can study it. We can see the cliff edge before we reach it. And perhaps, just perhaps, that knowledge gives us a chance that others did not have. The threats are real. Nuclear weapons exist and cannot be uninvented. Artificial intelligence is advancing faster than our ability to understand or control it. Climate change is altering the biosphere on which we depend. Each of these is a potential filter, a possible answer to the Fermi Paradox. But awareness is not nothing. A species that understands the risk of self-destruction is better positioned to avoid it than one that does not. This is not a guarantee. Understanding cancer does not mean you will not get it, but it improves the odds. And when the stakes are existential, even a small improvement in the odds matters enormously. There is a concept in risk theory called existential risk, defined as any risk that threatens the permanent destruction of humanity's long-term potential. The philosopher Toby Ord, in his book The Precipice, estimated that the probability of an existential catastrophe within the next century is roughly 1 in 6. 1 in 6, the odds of Russian roulette. This estimate accounts for nuclear war, engineered pandemics, unaligned artificial intelligence, and other threats. Whether or not you agree with the specific number, the exercise of thinking carefully about these risks is itself valuable. And this is where the great filter intersects with practical policy. If there is even a small chance that the filter is ahead of us, then reducing existential risk is not just prudent, but morally urgent on a cosmic scale. Every dollar spent on nuclear de-escalation, every regulation that makes artificial intelligence safer, every investment in sustainable energy is not just good policy for humanity. It is a contribution to the cosmic project of keeping the light on. The argument for becoming a multiplanetary species gains its force from this logic. If humanity establishes self-sustaining populations on Mars, on the moons of Jupiter and Saturn, eventually around other stars, then no single catastrophe can end us. The eggs are in more than one basket. The light is in more than one place. This does not solve the underlying problems of wisdom and self-restraint, but it buys time. And time for a young civilization facing unknown dangers is the most precious resource there is. There is a photograph that captures all of this. A photograph taken on February 14, 1990, by a spacecraft called Voyager 1. Voyager had been traveling for nearly 13 years. It had passed Jupiter and Saturn and was heading out of the solar system into interstellar space. At the request of the astronomer Carl Sagan, the cameras were turned around one last time. And from a distance of 6 billion kilometers, Voyager photographed Earth. In that photograph, Earth is a tiny point of light, a single pale blue pixel against the vast blackness of space, barely visible, easily missed. Sagan wrote about that photograph. His words are worth hearing tonight in this context as we think about the great filter and the silence of the cosmos. Look at that dot. That is here. That is home. That is us. On it, everyone you love, everyone you know, everyone you have ever heard of, every human being who ever was, lived out their lives. Every saint and sinner in the history of our species lived there, on a mote of dust suspended in a sunbeam. The Earth is a very small stage in a vast cosmic arena. Think of the rivers of blood spilled by all those generals and emperors so that in glory and triumph they could become the momentary masters of a fraction of a dot. Our posturings, our imagined self-importance, the delusion that we have some privileged position in the universe are challenged by this point of pale light. Our planet is a lonely speck in the great enveloping cosmic dark. In our obscurity, in all this vastness, there is no hint that help will come from elsewhere to save us from ourselves. No hint that help will come from elsewhere. Read that again in your mind. No hint that help will come from elsewhere. That is the essence of the great filter, distilled into a single sentence. We are on our own. The universe is not hostile, but it is indifferent. And in that indifference, in that silence, there is both a warning and an invitation. The warning is clear. No one is coming to rescue us. If we destroy our planet, no advanced civilization will intervene. If we annihilate ourselves, the universe will not mourn. The stars will continue to burn, the galaxies will continue to spin, and the silence will continue, unbroken, perhaps forever. But the invitation is equally real. The silence is not just an absence, it is a space, an open, waiting, unimaginably vast space. And if we survive, if we thread the needle of the great filter, if we find the wisdom to match our power, then that space is ours, not to conquer, but to fill, with knowledge, with beauty, with the quiet miracle of consciousness. Perhaps the silence is not a graveyard. Perhaps it is a garden that has been waiting patiently for 4 billion years for someone to tend it. It is late now. The questions we have explored tonight are vast, and they do not have easy answers. The great filter may be behind us, a testament to the improbable miracle of our existence, or it may be ahead, a challenge that will test everything we are and everything we hope to become. But here's what I want you to carry into sleep tonight. Whatever the truth is, wherever the filter lies, you are here. You are conscious. You are aware of the stars and the silence and the strange, beautiful improbability of your own existence. 4.5 billion years of cosmic history led to this moment, the formation of a planet from dust and gas, the first spark of life in a violent ocean, 2 billion years of patient waiting, an impossible cellular merger, the slow emergence of complexity. 5 mass extinctions survived, a supervolcano that almost ended everything, and then, somehow, a species that could think about all of it. That species is you. And the fact that you can lie here in the dark and contemplate the silence of the universe is itself the most extraordinary thing in the known cosmos. The stars are still out there, silent, patient, waiting to see what we will do next. Perhaps one day, 1,000 or 1,000,000 years from now, if we are very lucky and very wise, the silence will begin to fill, not with noise but with the quiet signals of a civilization that learned to survive, that learned to grow without destroying, that learned that the greatest power is not the ability to annihilate, but the ability to endure. Perhaps one day the great filter will have a name, not a threat, but a memory, a chapter in a story about a species that came from nothing, faced everything, and chose to live. Perhaps children on distant worlds will learn about the great filter, the way we've learned about the ice ages or the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Something that happened, something that was survived, something that made us who we are. And perhaps those children will look up at a sky filled not with silence, but with signals, the faint, beautiful, unmistakable hum of a universe that is finally waking up. Not because the silence was broken by some cosmic event, but because one species, on one small planet, decided that the silence was not acceptable, that consciousness was worth preserving, that the stars deserved to be visited. But that is a story for another time. For tonight, this is enough. You have traveled far. From the birth of the earth, through billions of years of patient waiting, through impossible mergers and lonely sparks and terrifying questions. You have walked the entire road that life has walked, and you have arrived here at this moment, in this quiet room, under these silent stars. Let the silence hold you now. Let it be a blanket, not a burden. The universe is vast and dark and quiet, and you are a small, warm light within it, a light that took 4 billion years to kindle, a light that the universe spent an eternity preparing for. That is enough. That has always been enough. Good night, and in your dreams, count the stars.